Good afternoon, friends, and thank you, Rachel, for such a beautiful introduction, and also the opportunity to start with what our core business is in music, which is music. Now, I'm going to start with a question. What do you think those sounds were underneath the piano? Can anyone guess what those sounds might be? Yes, what did you think it was? Yeah, it's some sort of crackling sound, isn't it? Anyone else? Yeah. Melting ice. Yeah, very, very interesting. So we have a feeling because of the image that there's something to do with ice or... God. Yes, that's right. I could have easily been making a sound like that acoustically, couldn't I? Now, what that sound is, at the Halley Research Station in Antarctica, which is run by the British Antarctic Survey, they had a project for 8 years where they did time-lapse audio of what they describe as the sound of the Earth breathing, the true acoustic ecology of the Earth. And so the receiver is 50 foot high and about 25 foot down, and it gets what's called ultra low frequency emissions. And it's actually the sounds that, for two reasons, we cannot normally hear in the Earth. One is that the Earth has too much background noise in most of it. So there's only, even in Antarctica, a few small places that are quiet enough to get this sound. And the other one is that there's a notion of what's called reciprocity within the Earth, the magnetic field and the ionosphere, that when you have a piece of lightning going at any point of the Earth in these few spots of Antarctica, you can hear it. Isn't that incredible? So what we were listening to was a number of things. One was what's called spherics hitting the ionosphere, and also what's called the chorus sound, which is basically it's magnetic fluctuations in the Earth's crust, as well as literally the sound of raising and falling temperatures in the Earth. So it's like our Earth has a personality, which they've been able to prove. And this project was called A Day in the Life of Halley, or otherwise called Aurora Musicalis, because what we found when we actually looked at it was that when the Aurora Borealis is showed, there's much more noise as well. So it's like we don't know if the noise is causative of the image or the image is causative of the noise, but it tells us something that everything is linked within our Earth. And the reason why I wanted to start with that is we've just had actually one of the artist engineers of that project visiting the School of Music. And that's a symbol of how we're reimagining what music education is. Because bringing someone like this and a project like this to a school of music makes us think about things that schools of music do not normally think about. Now, for example, it came with a very provocative and amazing picture of a number of us holding what's called an ice core. Now, ice cores are the things that the British Antarctic Survey drill, and they drill to a bedrock of 180,000 years, and they have the definitive measure of CO2 in the world's atmosphere, made in Antarctica. It takes 3 years to do one continuous ice core, and you can literally see what man-made global warming has done, because there's the graph, and then there's the graph. Like the normal graph paper cannot even actually see the difference. So we need a new scale to look at human global warming. So suddenly, as a school of music, we're thinking about large issues, and normally musicians are told to just be the entertainment. And we've been told historically that our role is to make people who can play fast or write nice music and actually just do their part and leave quietly by the back door. Quite seriously. So in reimagining our School of Music, we're thinking about these notions of what music is, of what education is, but we're also thinking about something quite profound, which is what music is in Canberra. Because I'm not sure if you know this story. There's been a few problems at the School of Music. I'm not sure if you knew, because if you don't read the Canberra Times, you wouldn't know. But if you have read the Canberra Times, you would know that Days of Our Lives is nothing of a soap opera compared to the way the Canberra Times reports on the School of Music. We seem to have more headlines than the present Prime Minister. And yet, in the meantime, we have this amazing school that at the moment has 180 students who have really what we think is world's best educational practice, where we've combined the best things of the conservatoire model, which is the idea that you train people to be like Olympic athletes in music, and then the notion of what maybe the liberal arts version of what this university can offer to students. So we get thinkers and makers together. In other words, embodying the notion of the exegetical artist within music, which is so important to us. So this is the School of Music in 2019. And when I said to a number of my colleagues that I was coming out here, they said they were so delighted for a couple of reasons. One is that they feel that we still have a lot of work to do in reminding the community that music has evolved. And one of the things we have to say is that we must teach music in the 21st century to be able to make the music of the 21st century. And that involves seeing the historical role of music very, very carefully. In other words, we have to conserve what needs to be conserved. So you can go into the practice rooms right now and hear, young students playing Chopin or Mozart or Beethoven or Brahms, the pinnacles of the canon of Western music. You can go into the composition lab and see people writing new music right now because it's the mid-semester break, and a large number of students have come in just to be creative, which is just truly wonderful. But then you can see students doing all sorts of fusion projects where they're working with animation, where they're working with video, where they're working with dance, where they're working with film, where they're even working with video game. And the reality is, as a school of music, we needed to catch up with what young people do today. Even a young player who's playing Beethoven on the violin, they're generally not listening to Beethoven when they go in their car and drive to the concert. They're listening to the same music other young people listen to. And so for us as a school of music to come to terms with reality took maybe a decade. And now that we've done it, all the other music schools are looking on in some state of envy. Because what happens in music is we have a version of the dreaded culture wars going on. So there's people who are saying, we need to teach the tradition, otherwise the world will destroy itself. And personally, I think it would be a much lesser world without the great aspects of Western classical music. They're beautiful. We can even add the term jazz, which is in many ways a form of Western classical music now. We teach it the same way we teach classical music, because people have to study theory, they have to learn scales, they have to play in ensembles, they have to be examined, because it just takes a lot of hours to make a musician. You know the cliche about 10,000 hours. We don't think it's 10,000 hours. We think it's 40,000 hours to make a musician functional, not even great. So we have this, incredible, I guess you'd say it's a sacred task to make good musicians. But at the same time, if we only just train them to do what happened 80 years ago or 100 years ago, what happens when the world changes? They'll come back with this degree that might enable them to do something that's really wonderful in a party setting, but has no functional use in most workplaces. So we've come to terms with this, and we're very excited how we've done it. And I thought I'd now move into the next stage by telling you how we've done that, and then we'll look at some of the conceptual underpinnings that really do this. So, now, pardon me, that's the guy who thinks he knows technology, maybe leaving his computer on, I'm not sure. But what I'd like to start with is, in most music institutions, you generally are only allowed to study music, of course. And here at the ANU, we have an incredible comparative advantage, the flexible double degree stream. And so what we've seen in the last 5 years is we've gone from maybe 10% of students to about 35% of students doing double degrees. And this is a profound change for us, because it means that we're attracting the students who have very high ATARs. And this is important because often very good players do not do their schoolwork, quite seriously, because they're obsessed by music. And it's meant that we've actually had to find a way to encourage those very good players to do their schoolwork, to say, if you want to study here, you actually need to be a more rounded scholar and thinker in order to come to this university, as opposed to one of the conservatoriums, because our ATAR is 80. The next highest is the Sydney Conservatorium with 70, the premier institution. So it takes 10 more marks to get into the ANU in little old Canberra than it does to get into Australia's most famous music institution, which is quite fascinating, isn't it? The second thing is, we had to then really think, if we're getting people to have this greater skill level, what is it that we should allow them to do in this double degree? And we realized it was to allow them greater flexibility. So if we're having all of these people doing it, we need to allow them to move more freely into the world of electives, and to be able to actually move outside of their just given major. Because how music has worked for the last 3 generations is, if you're a singer, you spend your whole degree just hanging around the singers. So you have, you might have 1 or 2 sort of foundational classes with the whole year, but really you do everything with the singers, and you've got these lifelong friends who are exactly the same as you. but you don't work with the instrumentalists, you don't work with the composers, you certainly don't work with the jazz musicians or the contemporary musicians, you know? And so we wanted to find ways that someone could just jump in and do another course and have this experience of something completely different, to give them the sense that they can have multiple identities as a musician rather than them just being trained in the image of their teacher, which is the old model. So that's a foundational difference, isn't it? The next difference is we thought, if this is the case, for those students who aren't doing the double degree, we needed to find a way to really embody this. And we came up with it almost by accident, because in the aftermath of 2012, the numbers at the School of Music went down significantly. And because of that, students were asking, do you mind if I do a double major? And normally in music institutions, almost no one gets to do what's called a double major. You might say, what is a double major? That might be being a performer and a composer, or a musicologist and a music technologist. In other words, two completely different musical careers on the surface anyway, and becoming good at both of them. It's a bit like a flexible double degree within music. And so this happened around 2014, 2015, and it was working quite well, but suddenly our numbers grew, and we had the choice. Do we become like every other music institution in Australia, and generally speaking the whole world, and actually just go back to saying, now you're a singer again, you're a composer, you guys can meet in the coffee shop, but you know, that was a nice little experiment, it's just too hard now. But we decided in a consensus model with the staff to actually indefinitely extend this, and what's more, to make it available to every single student who enrolled at the School of Music. So this is a world's first, and we're very, very excited by it. Because now, for example, our first year composition course, which historically took around 4 students, maybe up to 8 a year, has 50. Isn't that a profound change? So instead of training 4 to 8 composers, we're training 50 in first year. Now, out of those 50, about 15 are jazz musicians who are learning classical composition. 4 or 5 of them are music technologists, which is fascinating. Some of them are even people from other disciplines that we've said, we believe in you, we'd like you to do this first year of composition, even though you're not really ready for it, but we'll give you the extra time. And if you're good enough at the end of first year, we'll let you go on. The other thing that we've done is we've got about 25 who are doing our new major in composing for film and video games. So we have 2 composition majors now. Traditional composition, which is writing notes on a page for people to play, and one which is wholly about working on one of these, you know, where we embed technology completely into the compositional process. So that's an example in one of these. But another example is 3 Fridays ago. I'm walking, it's a quiet day, and I just see the red light on in our really amazing music studio, and something's going on. So I go in the back, and I see a classical concert pianist running a session on our $250,000 Neve Genesis desk. And I think this is the only institution where a classical concert pianist has been taught to make a recording in the state-of-the-art rock and roll studio in Canberra. It's quite astonishing, isn't it? She's recording classical music, but she's using the very best rock and roll gear in the world, because we modeled this studio on Abbey Road. So that's a pretty amazing skill set. And this is because any musician within the School of Music can take our sort of like our flagship course, which is recording in the studio. So it used to be that only 10 to 15 students would take that sort of a course, and they'd be only within the music technology course. And now every single student can learn that. And what's more, if they get a distinction, they are allowed to go any time in the future in their degree and have this $1 million studio for their own personal use. So what we're doing is we're sort of unlocking the gates of privilege. And we're saying that if you're smart enough, if you have enough interest, we will find a way to work with that interest. It's a fundamental conceptual difference. And it's only working in the School of Music because we've decided to end, in our school, any semblance of what is called in music the culture wars. Those who are conserving the old things, and those who are saying the future is the 21st century, we have to have technology and computers. And we're saying the future is everything. But it's not bland postmodernism. It's actually saying that the future is deep, detailed skills building within young musicians and enabling them from that space to be able to share it and make their own new careers in this world. So it's something that we feel, very, very excited about. And I can just tell you that the student experience has gone through the roof in the last year. And I'd like to tell you how I know this, because in order to find out about this experiment, we realized, funnily enough, it follows on from your wonderful presentation, because we feel that although CELTs play a very important role and that, the staff-student dialogue is very important, we needed another way to find out about this story. So we instituted the first annual School of Music bonfire in semester 1. So we went to the Fenner fire pit and we took all the staff and all of the students and we burnt stuff for about 4.5 hours. And I can tell you, we got more feedback in those 4.5 hours than we had in the entire year before. So we followed that up with semester 2, the inaugural School of Music Spics and Specs night, where we put together with our Music Students Association a very long thing where we got to have fun for about 5 hours and eat way too much pizza. And again, the feedback we got in that was absolutely superb. So we're saying that the only way this can work is if we also unlock the gates of feedback and we enable students to tell us what they think without fear or favour in the manner that they choose, which is usually informal. So after our big fire event, I came back to the Level 5 in the School of Music with about 20 students, and we had a focus group at 10:30 p.m. Isn't that astonishing? And the focus group was completely unstructured, but I couldn't take notes fast enough because they just told me in such a relaxed manner what was working about the school and what wasn't working about the school. And because we've said that we're here for the students first, it was like gold to me. So this is our conceptual change in the school. So how does it play out in terms of how we think about music? And now I want to go into briefly my computer and tell you a few things. And I'm going to actually ask my wonderful helper could we please play, we have 2 sound files for you. One is called Debussy 1 and Debussy 2. So we're going to listen to Debussy 1 for about 30 seconds. Then we'll listen to Debussy 2 for 30 seconds. And I want you to think about if there's any difference between those 2 recordings. You probably recognize the piece. It's called Clair de Lune, and it's one of the most famous pieces of piano music ever composed, one of those great impressionistic works. Let's listen to Debussy 1 now. Okay, now we'll try and remember that sound, because this is one of the essences of being a musician. We call it critical listening. Now listen to number 2. So, first of all, I'd just like to say, did you hear a difference between the 2 pieces? And I'd like us to maybe just use some words to describe the first piece. How would we describe that first performance of the Debussy? Very interesting. Very interesting. Let's have a few more people talk about, and you can talk, emotionally or technically or sound-wise, any way we can actually differentiate these two performances is as valid as any other way because this is how we listen. Any more ways? Yes. That's very interesting. Would people generally agree? It was like, to me, the first one was fuller. Did we feel that? It was thicker. It's like each note of the piano had like a bigger weight into it. And even if I turned the second one up, they should be at a similar level. But even when I turn the second one up, it's not quite the same. Now, so this is one piece of music and it has the same score. Does that make sense? So what this tells us is that there's a thing in music which we call the critical addition. And the critical addition is the point in which we say there's a singular version of music. Now that used to be the score. And can we see what an imperfect version of a critical addition that is? You know, because I can actually come up with 1,000 different ways of playing that piece by Debussy. But what recording has done is once we get that critical recorded edition of something, we cannot imagine it any other way. So recording has completely changed how we perceive music. And this is a process that the human brain calls entrainment. And, you know, literally people like Daniel Levitin have written about this in This Is Your Brain on Music. Once we hear something 3 to 4 times, we anticipate its sound and we get a particular type of neural firing. And so we actually know that sound intrinsically within the deepest workings of our brain. We are so smart in listening to music because all of us are virtuosic listeners. We have all listened to hundreds and thousands of hours of music by the time we are adults. It's quite astonishing, isn't it? Actually, all of us are experts. Every human is a world expert in listening to music because it's everywhere. You can't get away from it. So now I want to tell you something quite interesting, and I want you to guess which is which. One of these recordings was made in the 1970s at the end of what's called the analog era. Do you know what I mean by analog? In other words, it's not digital, right? It's not zeros and ones. It's someone recording onto a tape machine in a concert hall on a Steinway. And it's someone who spent their whole life playing Debussy, right? The other one was made by a guy that you're looking at on a keyboard. And that keyboard used what's called a sample and a combination of sample and synthesis of a piano. In other words, a recording of another piano that's triggered by a keyboard that was worth $100 that was then processed with algorithms whereby the sound of the tape was added, the sound of the room, the reverberance of the room was added, the equalization of that piano, a compressor was added to make the sound of the keys that don't even exist actually strike. So one was an act of complete and utter fakery. Guess which one?
The first one.
It's number one. Well done. But literally, without me going into this whole thing, literally you have no chance, generally speaking, because I've done this 100 times. You know, unless we talk about music first, without this conceptual understanding of it, we don't know. Isn't that it? But as soon as we get a conceptual understanding of music, could we see it's actually not that hard to hear which is which? Isn't that astonishing? So it's proof again that every musician has something quite wonderful within them. And if we can work as teachers to get this critical foundational ability, we can make remarkable people in the world. So that's a snapshot of how we work. Now, I thought we might take a 2-minute listening break too, and I wanted to give you an example of another big thing in this school of music, which is what we call interdisciplinary work. Now, we already had an example with Antarctica. This is going to be the dance of life. We're going to double click on that for a minute. And it's possibly one of those beautiful things of eye candy that we can experience.
That's why
So friends, I thought it's very important if we talk about music to have a musical experience, because the number one thing that we're training our musicians to do is give people experiences that stop time a little bit. You know, and we can say there's two ways to stop time. One is to be Einstein and to, be an incredibly leading astrophysicist or something. And the other one is to make spellbinding art. And the potential for music to make spellbinding art is paramount. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about this piece to see how it is that we try and do these things. So we hear an orchestra, right? So an orchestra has, of course, such feelings of grandeur and all of that. It's a string orchestra. And then we hear a flute, but it's not a normal flute. This is a South Indian flute, and that was actually the leading flautist of South India who played that at 81 years of age, Dr. Natarajan Ramani, who sadly died not long after that. So it's someone coming from an Eastern tradition working with the Western tradition. And there's something about South Indian music, it's called gamaka, which is it actually slides between the notes. And whereas Western music has between an octave 12 subdivisions, gamaka has 22. So it has a level of subtlety that is quite astonishing. And I think, why shouldn't a music school work with this? Why shouldn't we be able to say, if there's another culture in the world that can understand melody or the distances between notes with more subtlety than the West, we should experience it. So we have that. Then we also have, of course, the notion of what visuals do, don't we? So as soon as we add visuals, we make a new meaning to music. And Wagner called this the Gesamtkunstwerk, and a notion of total art. As soon as we put music to image, we get something that actually changes the human brain pattern. He didn't say it like that, but that's what we now understand. And so the piece was actually made for the Vivid Festival, which many of you would have heard about. And it was beamed on the front of the Sydney University Great Hall. So those two dancers were about 50 feet high. And then we had speaker stacks that played it. So about 10,000 people heard that piece at its opening, and hearing the sound in much more detail, even outside, than you could have. And this is what music can do these days. So we're seeing, and these were two retiring dancers of the Australian Ballet, so it was actually to say, somewhat sadly, that in your mid-30s, your career's over in this artwork. Isn't that sort of an astonishing thing, even to think about for a second? And so this is what music can do. We can bring together different cultures seamlessly, because we don't care that, is the balance right or the balance is wrong, if the artwork can answer the question, and the question is it good? If we can make really good art, we can stop the critical processes that undermine so much of our society. Not to say that we shouldn't be critical of things, but sometimes only being critical is to disable the potential for dreaming that we so need as a species. And so this is what music does. And I feel very, very strongly that as a school of music, we have the capability of teaching this and also fulfilling something even more important in the world. And we're going to listen to one more piece of music in a sec. And I'll just give you a preamble. One of the things that our school is making a real effort to do, which is to engage with its responsibilities around Indigenous culture and music. So a number of years ago, we hired Dr. Chris Sainsbury, our Indigenous convener, and also an Indigenous composer. And I get the great privilege of being Chris's assistant in a program called Naraburia, where we've taken 10 Indigenous composers and we've taken the ANU School of Music to them. So they get the very best that our school can offer, but they don't come to our building unless they want to. They're mostly in Sydney, some are from other places, and we bring them to wherever they want to be, and we give them access to the very best that Australia has to offer, and we see what music comes out. And this is because something happened in visual art a generation ago that we take for granted. That if you see a non-Aboriginal person paint a traditional Aboriginal story, you know it's wrong, right? And if you go and you see these things of, there's like a foreign fake of, a boomerang or a desert painting, and we want to see that thing in the bin, right? Now that at the moment does not happen in music. We get white fakeries of Aboriginal music all the time. And the only way we can overcome it is to train Aboriginal composers and Torres Strait Islander composers to make the best music in this country without fear or favour. So this is the job of the National University. And, it's going from that into many, many other things. I'm happy to say that as a school, we've had two wonderful pieces of news this week, and I always like to be in the here and now. One is that the ANU is looking towards a grand graduations project, very much Harvard style. And the school is facilitating a new Indigenous piece as the core of that, which I think is really, really fantastic. Another thing is one of our teaching partnerships is with the National Australia Day Awards, and we've just commissioned one of our Aboriginal composers to do the signature music for that. So we have an important role to play, not just in teaching our students, but to say that we're changing the landscape and the culture of Australia. So now I'm going to ask us to play the Naraburia one we have done, which is called Troy. We're going to just listen to a little bit of chamber music written by a man called Troy Russell, Indigenous man from Sydney, roots across New South Wales. Even though he's been a professional musician all his life, 2 years ago he started to learn to compose with the white Western scored system. And listen to what came out. Now I could listen to that piece all day because it has an incredible space, doesn't it? And we can say that Aboriginal ways of feeling this country can be translated into Western art music. And so this is what we're finding out, again, as a music institution. There's countless more examples, but I wanted to just finish with a quick wrap-up to say that how we're trying to do it is to be highly intellectual. There is no point in being the national university if we do not have the highest level of intellectual rigor. So at the same time as we're doing all of this, we're raising our standards in theory, in oral, in writing, because we want to actually have our standards higher than all the other conservatoires and universities. We're getting our standards of performance as high as is in the country because we think it's important that when you hear a musician from the ANU School of Music, you gasp at how good they are. You know, it's vitally important. But yet, once we do that, we see that as the foundational stuff, and we try and develop what we're calling the total musician in this School of Music, to think, is there a way that we can have people who are genuinely in service of this world and this time, because there is a role of provocateur and healer that musicians need to play in our current climate. So many thanks for listening, and I'd be delighted to hear if there's any thoughts, reflections or questions as well. Yes, we actually have quite a lot of students ordered, but other staff, if a staff member wants to come, I mean, you know, we'll have to close the doors at, you know, sort of 100, but I'd be delighted if people wanted to come and see things. And remembering there's so many events that we do too. Like, for example, tonight we're honouring Larry Sitsky, our emeritus composer. It's his 85th birthday. He's still writing music at 85. Isn't that astonishing? So we've got many of Australia's greatest composers and musicians coming to Canberra to celebrate this person. Then in, you know, a month's time, we have School of Music students playing with the Canberra Symphony Orchestra. So that's pretty exciting. And in between, you know, there's probably a concert every week or two. And then there's public lectures. We've just had a series of public lectures by a fellow called Vincent Plush, who's one of the great thinkers about Australian society. So if you have that interest and you think, I'd like to have these experiences, you can just go onto our website, see what's on, and just come to stuff. And if that doesn't work, just drop me an email, you know. And certainly, if your students want to come and do an elective course at the School of Music, it's something, I am a little bit biased, I must say, but I think to do one music course can change the life of so many students, because unfortunately the way music works is to make a student good enough to get into the School of Music costs many, many thousands of dollars by and large. So we see that apart from some accelerated programs we have in music technology and composition, it is skewed for those who have an upper middle class or even a greater amount of disposable income. It costs $80 to $100 to have a lesson off a great musician. And it takes a lesson a week for about 10 years to be a good enough student to get into that School of Music, in terms of performance anyway. But we have a number of courses that are open to anyone to come in, and we think this is part of the democratization of music that is so important to enable people to find new ways of making music. And that's why this thing, the computer, is so vital, because it can enable people who don't have that background but who are just as musical to make profound and deep music. So it's really amazing what the computer has done for music creation. Well, this is interesting. Now, I think we have a feeling that we're a little bit culturally smug about music, and this is because what happened in music is a bit like what happened in art in the 20th century. At the end of the 19th century, everyone thought everything had been done, and then along came all these isms. So we have like modernism, we have impressionism, we have in music a thing called atonality, which is where you suddenly no longer have a key for music. Every single note is played before you play another note. We have people doing all sorts of experiments about music, but somehow we're reverting back to what's called tonality, sweet music with a tune and chords, because the human desire to make things that are sweet, it seems to be unstoppable. So we're at a point now we're incredibly postmodern, and we're getting quite happy about it. And I think what's going to happen is quite profound, because computing is changing music. Now, for example, I have on this computer, not many people do because it takes a lot of horsepower, but I have a sample of every single orchestral instrument on my computer. So I can play a virtual orchestra. I can actually load up a score, and I can assign that score to fake orchestral instruments and have it play so that maybe 50% of the people wouldn't even be able to tell the difference. And that's now. So in 50 years' time, that technology, which is in its birth, will be so good, most people will not be able to tell the difference. We'll also have artificial intelligence composing music. We're at the cusp of this as well. I have a number of colleagues overseas who are doing this to the point where literally I've sat on a piano and I've heard an algorithm copy me and play with me already. And this, again, it's not that good. So this will happen whether we like it or not. Driverless cars, driverless instruments. Now, the School of Music is purchasing next year what's called a Disclavier piano. That's a piano that I could send data, which is called in music MIDI data, and that MIDI data can actually make the piano play without a human there. So this is where music is going. Technology will change it. But at the same time, it seems as good as technology is, there's a vibrational effect of live performance that is unstoppable. So even though we got seduced by recording, we're starting to realize as a species there's something about the art of communicating with a real live person who does something that is influenced by me and by my, whatever we want to call that connection, an intellectual, a vibrational, a soul connection, whatever we call it, some connection happens. And that seems to be coming back at a rate that no one anticipated. And I'm personally so excited by that, because music has the potential to grow us as a species of humans. And I think that will be the greater change, that we'll actually go back to doing things in smaller venues and smaller spaces to enable, music as an antidote to the disassociation of modern life. I think without doubt that will be a huge role for music. And the last thing about music is the resolution of the recording will change dramatically. Now, at the moment, when you record music, it sounds pretty good, but it's still a bit different to how you hear it live. We're just on the cusp of changing that now. So again, there's a new series of technology just emergent. It's mainly used in Europe. We're starting to trial it next year at the School of Music, where we record 11 times at CD quality. And when we record 11 times at CD quality, we get something that is very similar to the old analog recordings, but it has the clarity of digital. So this stuff will grow over the next 50 years, and we'll get something that is so realistic, and we'll have, multiple ways to listen to music, so you can actually position yourself. If there's an orchestra, you could put your headphones on and choose where you will position yourself. Do you want to be in the second row or the fifth row or with the conductor. And that technology is already being developed now. We have microphones that are multiple microphones in one that you can actually change your listening perspective. Again, it's crude, but in another 50 years, it's not going to be crude. So this is where I think music will go. What a lovely question to answer. Well, I think what you've already done is a great start. I want to give you a little anecdote. Last year I was doing some work at Cambridge, and I was there with my son, and we went on a tour in Scotland. And the tour is to the Highlands, and the fellow was he was an out of work historian with a PhD. So it was like an 8-hour tour with incredible. I mean, I was in rapture. A wonderful scholar who's published about 12 books on the subject. And everyone else is going, "Oh my God, I'm so bored," and I'm going, "This is incredible." So we're talking at lunchtime. I said, "This is fantastic." He said, "But why doesn't anyone else like it?" I said, "Because there's no experience." I had to give him the bad news, because it was just wonderful information upon wonderful information. And if we can find a way to embed experience and short-circuit intellectuality, people get an emotional breather, and then their intellectual selves are refreshed. I think there's plenty of research about this, whether that's done, and for example, in the Nordic countries, if they're not using music or creative arts in structured learning, they're getting up and having a quick run or movement. You know what I mean? And that's the other way to do it, is to have things that short-circuit the normal rhythms of the human body, because so much of what we do is defined by our day-to-day rhythms. So that's one thing we can do. Another one is, and I want to ask you to ask for more money, because the ANU needs to spend more money. In most places, even the School of Music, the musical playback's really poor. So if we can get good listening spaces that are quieter, that you can hear music better, you have a more deep and a more profound listening experience. And so I think to enable that then when you listen to music, you can listen more profoundly, and to set up a culture of allowing music to, how would I describe it? I would say allowing yourself not to comment on it intellectually when you are listening to it, to trust that you have the ability to later make sense of the meaning. This is how we best listen to music, and when we do it in embedded structures of other disciplines, it's quite profound. In other words, we can then use that time to make meaning of what we've already been told, but also anticipate the future meanings in lectures. So I think this works very well. Now, when we have musicology lectures, we're very, very careful to do what I did today, to have enough musical listening breaks to enable this to happen. So this is very much our practice, even in our more discursive courses. The only other thing I would say, and again, I'm biased, I think even if you're not a music lecturer, there's nothing wrong with playing a little bit of music or singing. One of the things that's changed in the last 2 generations, we have an idea that you have to be a professional to make music. And that's a load of codswallop. I think everyone has the same right to have musical expression as anyone else. And really, it's vital that, if you have a song, maybe people learn it, rather than just hearing it. And the act of doing that is quite astounding. And, one great adherent in education, of course, is Rudolf Steiner in his Waldorf schools. So he went to a lot of trouble thinking that particularly young children up until the age of 12 needed to sing every day to become good learners. And he felt very strongly that even if you sang for 5 to 10 minutes a day, you would learn better. Now, I don't think that's been scientifically verified yet, but people have done fMRI studies of what happens to the brain when music is being played, or more importantly, performed or sung. And what happens is that the 2 hemispheres of the brain have greater dialogue. So we know this for a fact. And the other thing is that the amygdala is regulated more. So in other words, regulating, the highs and the lows of the emotions seem to happen through regular music practice. And I think that works no matter what your discipline. So we have something that is, music, without being music therapy, will always be therapeutic. It's just one of those wonderful things that we just have as a given. Yes, ring our front desk. So we have a wonderful woman called Emily Allen there, and she's actually our agent for all our music students too. So she knows who does what. I mean, we do a lot of gigs for the university. So that takes, we have one, it's a third of one staff member's job just to make sure that when Brian says, I want this, that we can give it to Brian, because otherwise he'll give it to us. So, so we think that, so we have that. Now, of course, I must be honest, we have a lot of people coming to us, so we can't do every single thing we're asked. But yet at the same time, our students are incredibly interesting people who want to collaborate all the time. So if it's an interesting project, a musician will be, generally quite happy. The only thing I'd say about young musicians is now when you book a brain surgeon, you generally pay them, and when you book a musician, you generally don't. We have to ask ourselves why, as a culture, as someone who stands up for musicians, And so a big part of my advocacy is to make sure that musicians are looked after. It's about what we were talking about the union before, We actually have to create a culture where music, sadly speaking, it needs to be economic, to enable musicians to still be trained. So that's my only caveat about that. But we have, music students doing all sorts of cool and kooky things every day, through the uni and beyond it. I can barely keep up with it because I just have them all coming into my office excited now, and it's just truly wonderful, because there is something about the spontaneous act. Now, for example, in the last week, we've had two different startup choirs approach the School of Music. Can we auspice and run them, in the community? And that's in 1 week. And we've had 6 international guest artists approach us. Can we work with the students? So we have, we really are this melting pot for the whole city. And that's why I do get a little bit distressed when the Canberra Times tells a little bit of rubbish about us, because, the scrutiny compared to the social function this School of Music does is unbelievable. And I think completely wrong, Like, we have more scrutiny than the federal government, quite seriously. It's astonishing. And some days I feel the pressure that our staff are put under is not fair, because of that. So I just wanted to give you that as a thought. So when you meet people and they say, what about that School of Music? Stand up for us. It's really important in the community to say, this School of Music is good, because it is. I can tell you it's my 4th School of Music in my career. I'm at that sort of upper mid-career period. So I've been around the traps, and this is the best that I've been involved in a long way, because we finally had the chance to think about politics and social responsibility without dumbing ourselves down, and yet we're still thinking about how people can make a living. So we haven't said that we're ignoring the creative industries of music, but we take the view that if you make an excellent musician and you make them smart, they should be able to earn a living. And hopefully change the world. I couldn't agree more. Any more questions before we finish up?
Thank you very much, Kim.